To that at the end. So look, without further ado, time's marching on. I'd like to introduce Ian and Tom from PwC, from the third-party risk practice. So, gents, over to you to tell us a bit more about yourselves and why you're here. I must say, actually, before I let him talk, that many of you will have noticed that Ian is a familiar face because Ian is our PwC lead on our Stage 3 product as well. So if you like what he says today, you should definitely sign up to our Stage 3 products, because then you'll be seeing a lot more of him. So Ian, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm surprised you missed the opportunity to take some sort of a shot at me, which you have form for. Good morning, everybody. Really thrilled to be here. Such a interesting topic, AI and generative AI. Not that what we don't usually talk about is fascinating as well, but this is very new to a lot of us, and it's equally becoming very pervasive. And it is very, very important that we pause and reflect and think about where we are with AI in our supply chain and across our third parties. Before we get into it, just by way of quick introduction, as Paul mentioned, I'm a director with PwC. I work in our third-party risk management team. I lead the service that we're delivering with Hellios currently, but I also lead our broader managed service business as well as our technology services business. I also work with clients, and there is definitely some on the call here today across financial services, just doing broader advisory type work. So helping clients get their framework right and their operating model right, and maintaining and meeting regulatory expectations. I'm joined by my colleague Tom Kohler, who will introduce himself in a brief moment when I hand over to him. But before I do that, I think we just want to pause really briefly, and hopefully the slides moved on as I went there. When we are talking about AI and generative AI in third-party risk management, there's two lenses that we can look through to think about this. And certainly as we were preparing for the session, we thought about the two angles that we could maybe discuss for the next sort of 30 minutes. The first is, we as a bunch of practitioners of third-party risk and own that risk within our organizations, how do we embed AI into our own programs and our own processes, drive efficiency and productivity within that? The second is, we are also responsible for the risk of engaging suppliers and third parties. So how do we make sure that we're comfortable that that's not bringing undue risk into our business, and we're managing that appropriately and doing the right governance and reporting around it? On the former of those two topics, I think we could probably spend an entire day working through various different use cases for all the different opportunities. But we purposely said we're going to park that, and we're going to focus on the latter, which is really focused on what are some of the practical things that we can all start doing today to start to manage that risk. And we'll get into a little bit of detail on that in a while as well. In terms of the agenda, so Tom is going to spend a little bit of time up front level setting the understanding of what AI and generative AI are. I think we're all broadly familiar, but I think there is a little bit of misconception and confusion across the market as to what falls into what category and whether it's new or whether it's emerging, et cetera, et cetera. So Tom will cover that along with the regulatory landscape, which I think will be super relevant and topical to everybody here. Obviously, we've seen what's come from the EU, and we're all awaiting a UK piece, which will come in, and again, Tom will cover that. And then I'll spend the sort of second half of the session getting into some of the more tactical and practical things that we can all start to do as we start to manage this risk, which is no longer a risk on the horizon or an emerging risk. I think it's very real today, and we have to start taking actions. So on that note, let me hand over to my colleague Tom, and if you want to move on, Tom.
Sure. Thanks, Ian, and thank you, Paul, for inviting us along today. So Tom Kohler, I'm a director in the third-party risk management team here in London. I work alongside Ian. A couple of focus areas that I have include sort of data and TPRM, and how we make use of data on third parties, and what those data structures need to look like, and where we can source that data from to monitor third parties. Another area that I look after relates to everything we do with the cloud, the hyperscalers especially, but everything that we do in the cloud region. I'm sure everyone's familiar. There's quite a few reg requirements around use of cloud, and we help clients navigate through those. That dovetails quite nicely with this AI piece, because something that you need to be doing if you're doing AI or Gen AI is using cloud services as part of it, and the two go hand in hand. So it's a little bit about my background, and as Ian said, I am going to first of all just talk a bit about what artificial intelligence is, and I don't want to I don't want to labor this point because these are concepts that everyone's become familiar with in the past few years. But what I did want to draw out is that when we're talking about AI, we are in some respects not talking about something that's new. Gen AI has really exploded over the past 2 years and has really captured everyone's imagination, and there's a huge amount of focus around the opportunity and the threats it can bring, and we're talking about some of those later today in the third party context. But what's on the screen currently brings out is the concepts of artificial intelligence, which is just having systems, machines that could make decisions for you to achieve a specific purpose, it kind of in a way that a human does, has been around since the 1950s, and when we first started talking about the concept of AI machines and the work that Turing and others did. And that's the root of this idea that this is something that normally a human would do the reasoning, but we're giving the reasoning to a computer to do instead, and what they can do is mimicking what a human can do. Now, within AI, in the 1980s, machine learning came along, which is this idea that we build systems that can themselves learn and improve their performance on a particular task or analysis over time on their own. And so again, machine learning's been around since the 1980s. It's not a new concept. But what has really changed with the deep learning has emerged and increased the power of machine learning. And then what generative AI has done in the past couple of years is really changed the pace, because one of the things that Gen AI does is take what used to be a really specialized and very expensive thing to do, which is machine learning or deep learning. You need data scientists, you need a lot of computing power in-house, to really working on very, very specific use cases that takes a huge amount of investment to build. And what Gen AI has done is completely changed that, and has basically puts AI power in everyone's hands on their desktop, through the cloud, and really democratizes it. Anyone can be going out building AI use cases, playing around with it, experimenting, coming up with bits of kit that solve business problems and introduce risk. So that's just a bit of the background on where all of this has come from. It can sometimes seem like AI is something we're suddenly all talking about, but there is a long history behind it. And the reason I'm stressing that is when we come to talking about the risk management approaches around this, some of those are not new. Ideas about model validation and things are not new. If we jump on to the next slide, what we've got here is pulling out some of the key risks that we think about and that the regulators are thinking about when we talk about AI, and especially generative AI and the extent of its use. So clearly, this involves processing a large amount of data. Often people's personal data might be being used in some of these models. It raises all sorts of questions that slot into existing data protection and security regulations and sort of controls that we have. So there's a challenge to navigate how we do good data protection in the context of using people's data to train our models, for example. It raises a big question about accountability, because if we're handing it over to these machines or these Gen AI models to make decisions on our behalf, that raises a question mark about who made those decisions, or where did those decisions come from. And again, if you're making in a financial services context, if you're making decisions that impact your customers, you need to be able to explain to the regulators, to your senior management, to your customers themselves, how those, who's made those decisions and who owns the responsibility for them. It raises a whole governance issue around how do we put in place the appropriate governance structures to ensure that generative AI, or AI more broadly, is being used safely. Do we understand how it's being used in our organization or by our third parties? Who controls that? Who has the final say on whether or not we can do particular things? And this is a little bit in tension with the desire that a lot of businesses have to really push and lean into generative AI and do as much as possible, and let's get the use cases, let's get them out there, that can conflict a little bit with having strict governance around it. There's some risks to do with the models, and this is not new to anyone who's familiar with sort of model risk control, but you can have biases in the underlying data that's being used to train the population, and those biases become almost hidden as a result of coming out of this tool. So if you've trained, if you've got a credit decisioning model, for example, if you've trained it on a set of data that's imperfect in that it contains biases, for example, based on people's gender, ethnicity, age, hidden biases in that data, that those biases could translate into the model, and then you've got decisions that are being made that are biased against a particular sector. And this is really exacerbated by sometimes there's a view that because it's come from the tool, from the model, from the computer, it must be unbiased. It's not a human making the decision. We've handed it over to the computer and the computer can't be biased. So the bias becomes hidden in that regard. And then the last point here that the regulators are very hot on and are very interested in is this point about explainability. Gen AI models especially are quite black box in their reasoning. You give them a question, they give you an output, but what you can't really do is go and analyze how the model took that question and got to the answer. It's not actually possible to do that. So again, if you're using that model to make business decisions, you can't go back and explain afterwards necessarily how that decision was come to, which flies in the face of a lot of, the regulator's outlook in financial services, that if we're giving customers decisions and the outcomes for customers, we need to be able to explain how we got to those outcomes. So these are some of the risks that we think about when we think about increased use of AI. Obviously, the regulators are very interested in this area and are sort of coming up with responses to it. The most developed response so far has been the EU AI Act, which applies obviously across the EU. And I won't try and describe the detail of it here. We don't have the time, but I would encourage people to go and read about it, because contrary to some European regulations that we deal with, it's actually quite easy to pick up and understand what it's talking about. And it's quite a sensible piece of legislation in how it thinks about some of these topics. It tries to establish a uniform legal framework for the use of AI. It's looking at it in the context of people's fundamental rights, especially, I've already talked about data protection there and people's rights as data subjects. And then it starts to classify into 4 buckets AI risk levels associated with certain types of AI use case. And those range from forbidden, so things that will never be allowed in the EU, and that includes things like social scoring models using AI, through to high risk, sort of, the categories are then broadly high, medium, and lower risk. And it proposes sets of rules that you have around those. It does make this point that they want to be pro-innovation in this space. This is not about choking off any use of AI. I think the regulators are realistic that this is happening. It's more about coming up with what they call a human-centric and trustworthy wrapper for that allows us to govern it well. In the UK context, to date, the previous government had what they called a very pro-innovation approach to AI, which was sort of broadly translated as light touch from a regulatory perspective. Labour have already announced that they are going to bring they're going to bring forward an AI bill in the coming Parliament. It will be in the King's Speech later today, we understand, and it's likely that they will seek to have a slightly more restrictive regime under that act. We don't know what the content will be yet. My guess is that it will closely follow the EU AI Act, partly because, as I've said, the EU AI Act is reasonably sensible, and also because we know that the new government has this, in contrast to the previous government, is quite committed to some form of regulatory alignment with the EU. So it's likely we'll follow that. So that's quick canter through, what is AI? What are some of the key risks that the regulators are particularly interested in? and what's the regulatory response been to that.
And actually, Tom, just to check, just to step in a second there, what we can do for everyone is we'll send out, I'll try and get it into the chat, we'll send it after the links to there's a core regulation, the paper, as you say, is very good. There's also a link to there's a compliance checker where you can go through and sort of start to get you thinking about the sorts of questions you should be thinking about for yourself, but also remember, think about your suppliers. There's an AI Act, which is like a summary kind of vision statement as well. And there's all sorts of other good documentation there. So we'll pick out a couple of the key links for you so you don't have to go down the Google rabbit hole on this stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. That will be really, really helpful. Yes. And so let me hand back to Ian, because even if your organization is not using AI yet or exploring it, your suppliers almost certainly are. And so Ian's going to talk a bit about what this means for the supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That was a really good overview. So where we are currently, we've over the past few months started to think about what are some of the areas that you will embed into your programs to start understanding that risk within your supply chain. So if we start to think about AI and generative AI as a new risk type that you need to map across your supply chain, we started to think about what would be the subdomains within that, and how do those sort of questions and controls, how do they align ultimately to manage that risk. A lot of the points Tom has just covered around the specific risks with AI at a more macro level, some of the regulatory expectation, we've mapped through those. Obviously, this is a guideline, and certainly to Tom's point, we will look at what comes out in the UK and elsewhere, and if that moves, this could potentially move as well. But I think it's a really good starting point. And this really is about starting to think about, to the previous point that Tom just left us with, is how do we start to gauge what has been done in our supply chains ultimately with our third parties. So the first couple of areas that we really need to start asking questions around and thinking around is the data that's being used. How are we and how are our suppliers comfortable that data is reliable, it's accurate, it's up to date? Because ultimately, if the data is not right and it's creating the wrong foundation for the entire model. Equally, the models need to be clear. We need to understand how decisions are made. There's obviously transparency challenges depending on the type of persona that you're using AI, but obviously we are accountable to understand some of the methodology behind that. I think bias mitigation, and generally speaking, bias is one of the bigger risks and concerns with the broad adoption of AI. How do we make sure that it's not driving the wrong outcomes? Again, really focusing on what our suppliers are doing around that is super important. The regulatory compliance angle is really interesting. So a lot of times, these systems they'll be third-party systems, or they'll be bringing in third-party developers to build these systems. We are, as firms, we're still accountable for the regulatory compliance. We're accountable for the risk behind it. So we need to make sure as a collective that we are clear on some of the changes. We are tracking through. We're understanding the nuances and differences between the various different territories and the frameworks that have been brought out in much the way we would do with any other sort of regulatory framework. I think understanding the cyber controls around it and the broader protection controls is critical, because AI is such a powerful tool. In the wrong hands, in the hands of a bad actor, it can go very wrong very fast. So making sure that where we are having that developed on our behalf, that it's being done in a secure and robust way. In terms of the human oversight, I'm an auditor, as many of you know, by my training. So I always like the concept of a kind of a 4-eye review, or I like a second person to look at any kind of major decision that's been made or major outcome. And the use of AI is absolutely no different to that. So the concept is human in the loop. How do we make sure that our suppliers, or we, have a human in the loop and we're able to validate the decisions and the outcomes that are being made? Last couple of points in terms of the ongoing monitoring. How do we ensure that these models get the right feedback, that the performance is being measured and tracked and it's getting better over time and it's being used properly and appropriately? And finally, the ethical use. So not too dissimilar to the data and the bias. How do we make sure that our suppliers are creating ethical guidelines, they're engaging stakeholders properly, and they're notifying, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really useful to pause for a second, right? So we've spoken about this as a broader concept, and before we move into some of the things that we need to do over our individual third parties, it's really important to take a minute to think about which persona of AI and generative AI our third parties would fall into, because it is a little bit apples to oranges depending on how it's used. So we've mapped through 5. I'm not sure if this is necessarily exhaustive and this could change over time, but these are quite instructive. And the first is where we've brought in a specialist firm to develop an AI model or tool on our behalf. In that scenario, we own the model. We're accountable for the execution of it, for the performance, for the feedback, everything around that. So when we're thinking about that supplier, we need to be comfortable that they have the right development practices and they've considered all those previous points that we mentioned on the previous slide. But actually, in terms of the execution of the model, that's really us as our own firms to manage that in that persona. The second is probably the most clearly understood, and I'd say it's probably been the inflection point for AI over the past couple of years. And that's where we've seen these sort of industry standard standalone applications come online. ChatGPT is the very obvious one. And ChatGPT from OpenAI is a really interesting use case because it's absolutely not customized. Anybody can use it. And that model typically doesn't learn from your behaviors. So you retrain it every time you reopen the app, or it's very specific to you and the questions that you ask it. And really, when you see these releases coming out from the likes of OpenAI, that's what they're doing. They're embedding that feedback over time. So in theory, it's a slightly lower risk adoption. But again, obviously, it depends on how it's being deployed and it's in line with various different regulatory expectations from the EU that Tom mentioned a while ago. I'll class the third and fourth together because they're quite similar. And this is where we're using software or platforms in our organizations. It has a core set of functionality, but that developers of those platforms have added on a bolt-on for AI. So think of the obvious example is Microsoft Copilot. Some of our HR management systems, we see some sort of modules being added on there as well. I'm really conscious that I'm being recorded, so please don't quote me. But to me, that's a slightly lower risk category. Just because I think there's a set of expectations that these are large providers, that they're being used at scale. There's codified development practices, and there's an inbuilt level of trust. That said, it does not absolve us from accountability and making sure that we're comfortable that the data being used is the right data to use, the decisions being made are not going to bring undue customer harm, and so on and so forth. And the final one is the one I'm personally most uncomfortable about. And that's where we have an outsourced service typically, and through the provision of that service, our supplier has embedded an AI workflow or model into the provisioning of the service itself. But we're not always necessarily aware that that's happening because it could be happening downstream or in the back office. There's an inherent risk there, right, that we're just not aware in its nature because we're not being told, and it's up to the suppliers of those services to engage us and let us know. Obviously, we have an opportunity through our governance forums and everything else to ask those questions. But I get a little bit frightened when I hear of services that are being delivered and an AI is a component of it, but maybe the actual third party or our clients weren't necessarily aware that was the case. So hopefully that's helpful, just bringing to light that this isn't all, the same thing, and it's a little bit apples to oranges. What I wanted to do, just with the few minutes that we've left, is to sort of bring this down a level and help everybody bring it to life in terms of some of the actual tactical activities that we can ultimately start doing. This life cycle that you see on screen here, this looks probably quite familiar to, I'm sure, everybody, or at least most of the people on this call's supplier life cycle. It's certainly mapped through to our own framework that we typically use. And it's broadly speaking the 5 stages of a supplier life cycle, from pre-contract through to post-contract and termination. And I think our view is that there are activities specific to AI that we need to be doing at each point within this life cycle. So to start from a planning point of view, I think we need to be really comfortable that when we're thinking about outsourcing a service or engaging a supplier to deliver a service, is that service on some sort of restricted list like Tom covered from the EUI, where it's a high-risk service, or there's potential for serious customer harm as a result of it. We need to be also very comfortable that that service and the application of AI within that service is within our own organizational risk appetites. And there is a bit of thinking needs to be done rather than going head in and then realizing sort of 6 months into production that AI is being used in a service you're not comfortable with. The second is around pre-contract due diligence. This is our real opportunity as we do engage a supplier, and assuming that we are comfortable that AI can be used in the provision of the service. This is where we need to understand what policies and procedures, what development practices does the supplier have around the use of AI. Actually, sometimes it's just as basic as asking the question, do you intend to use AI in the provision of the service? I know that seems really basic, but it's a really important question to ask. And then going through your various, and we could go back to the wheel that we had up a few slides ago, but really starting to think through all the questions that would support that wheel. And this is the time to do it, because obviously, as you guys will know, with every risk domain, once you're live, it's a lot harder to move the needle than it is in a pre-contract scenario. From a contracting point of view, it's quite obvious that we will need to put in clauses into our contract that govern and control the use of AI. Something like along the lines of, please notify us if you're going to use AI for the service that we haven't been previously informed about, and other sort of like SLAs and penalties and various clauses that you might expect in a normal contract, just in the context of AI. Really critical to get that right at this point in time. In terms of the ongoing monitoring and governance during the in-life contract, I think mapping back through what we found through our due diligence and our own planning and risk assessments, we move into a production environment. We need to make sure that we continue to monitor the use of that. Where we may have engaged a supplier who didn't necessarily meet all of our expectations in a due diligence, but had a commitment to resolve and increase their baseline, etc. Like anything else or any other risk domain, just making sure good housekeeping to come back and check in that they've actually made those changes over time. And then determination is a really interesting one. And Tom and I were having a bit of a conversation about this over the last week as we got ready for this session. It's a really interesting point, termination in general, right? It's a really, not interesting, really topical point over the last few years, right? With the various expectations from SS221 and whatnot. When you're engaging a supplier to deliver an AI-enabled service, what are the specific provisions you need to do when you're terminating that relationship? To me, it comes back to the data, making sure that your data is returned. If your supplier's model has, learned true use of your data, then that's, I guess, your supplier's IP ultimately, right? And I think that's just the consequence of doing business or using AI. I don't necessarily think it's a big problem, but I think you need to be really comfortable that you're checking all those boxes. And I would start to do that in advance, have that ready, specific to AI. What are some of the things that we need to do as we start to exit or terminate an arrangement or contract? As you see on the right-hand side of the screen, I think our view here is that AI just needs to become its own risk type, its own risk domain, whatever language we're using. That needs to happen now. I think was it Paul or Tom mentioned earlier, most of the services that we're receiving, or certainly a large portion of them, will have AI somewhere in the supply chain. So I think
that's a key point though, Ian, because when we discussed this at a previous face-to-face TWG, firms are kind of grappling. We got the sense firms were grappling about where to put this, who to give it to, or what policy to align it to. Yeah. So whether it be a privacy matter, a data governance matter, a cyber matter, and it doesn't seem to have any consistent natural home right now. So, for people on the call, if you haven't had that conversation about ownership, you probably need to kick that off now.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And Paul, and I completely agree with that point. And that's very similar to cloud as well, in that cloud governance has sort of typically fallen among a number of different stools without clear ownership. So, yeah, similar challenge to navigate.
My one overarching piece of advice here would be, don't wait on this. There isn't an obvious answer, and it's certainly an emerging topic that we're all getting our hands around and our heads around. But now's the time to act, right? Whether to the point, Paul, right? Who owns it? That's up for debate. But we can't afford to sit in our hands because it's becoming a pervasive issue. And then just to close, some of the more kind of tactical questions that you can start asking of your suppliers. Look, I've put a few examples on screen, but I think not too dissimilar to other risk types. You need to be comfortable that your service provider has a policy and procedure in place that governs the implementation and use of AI. You need to understand the impact of a compromise. You need to understand what sort of security controls are around that. I think really interesting to think about the data here as well. So again, right, just understanding what is the data governance framework in place, or how do they, adhere to your own data governance standards depending on which persona that you're using. And then finally, incidents, right? Have we started to think about an incident that's caused as a result of an AI front end or back end? So is there a specific set of procedures that needs to happen as a result of that? As I said, we've jotted down a few examples, but if you start to work back through the previous slides, I think some of the questions will be fairly obvious and straightforward. But obviously, equally should map through to your own policies and procedures and control statements.
Well, I think your compliance people also would love to read the AI Act in detail, because there's some heavy hints in there about the sorts of things we should be asking. There's almost a section around how do you know that your suppliers classified or even risk assessed properly their use of AI?
Yeah.
And the challenge is that for you to do, or is that on the supplier to do?
Yeah.
Because there is a strong push for, I think, Tom, I got this right, for high risk AI instances to be centrally registered as well. So we could be moving towards a world where you can actually pick up their independent certification from a central register and not have to repeat all this stuff. Is that right, Tom?
So I'm trying to unmute myself. Yes, indeed, there will. Yeah, that level of scrutiny, and probably equivalent in the UK then following that.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then of course you've got the mitigating controls, as Ian said. So how do you know that the firm's managing the risk, your supplier's managing the risk within their world? So there's a if you're thinking about, which is what we want you to do, thinking about the questions that you'd want us to ask your suppliers on your behalf, you need to kind of think about this from all the angles that Ian and Tom have outlined here. Sorry, Ian, I'll let you close because
I think we're I'm not going to labor this slide, right? But just because I think conscious we're probably slightly over time, and I do want to open up the questions, and I can see that there are some have come in already. I think, look, for me, the most important thing here is, and I think it was Tom mentioned, right? The EU's view on AI is they don't want to be a blocker to innovation. They understand this needs to happen to move the world forward. So I think we should all embrace that. I don't think anybody should be scared, and I don't think we should have a computer says no outlook to engaging AI into our services. That to me is really important. There's huge opportunity. There's obviously risk, so we need to make sure that we're just doing it in a thoughtful way, and where ultimately we've got a set of controls and procedures in place ourselves that allow us to get the visibility, the transparency, and ultimately report on it and be comfortable that that's being used in a proper manner, whether that's internally or across our supply chain, which most people here would be a little bit more concerned about, I would have thought. So I'll pause there and I will hand over to Paul. I think you're going to MC the questions as they come
well, we have 8 questions so far, so don't be shy, people. Please use the Q&A and get stuff in. I think the first question from Diana here is around that kind of inputs into that risk assessment. So definitions of a decision, an AI decision for the ICO is different between AI and GDPR. So when you're using AI to paraphrase, a chat summarization through a chatbot, that's not making a decision. How do you factor those sorts of things into the risk assessments of what the AI is doing? How do you reconcile those different points of view?
Yeah, it's a really good point because it points to the level of complexity in the regulatory landscape that firms will need to navigate when dealing with this, because unfortunately different regulations do have slightly different or differing definitions of certain concepts like decisions. And when you're undertaking your risk assessment, you will need to have regard to each of those alternative definitions from the regulations as you're thinking about the regulatory implications for the use case that you're looking at. So I don't want to, it's going to be case by case. That's something the risk assessment will have to consider.
And do we inherit the worst case?
Well, I think it's more looking at the use case in order to make a determination. Is it a decision from a GDPR definition point of view? Is it a decision from an ICO definition point of view? And then I wouldn't assume the worst case, because you'll find that's quite restrictive on yourself, and you might lose some of the benefit that you're aiming for with using AI in the first place.
Yeah.
If you need to do the analysis that enables you to access the benefit without being overly restrictive.
Thank you. Any more questions, please, people? Please put them in the chat. One thing I heard Tom and Ian to sort of ponder on is that a stat from another conference, another call, that said about 78% of firms are using AI and they don't even know it because their employees are bringing their own AI to work. So people are outside of the firm's ecosystem and technology stack are using ChatGPT on their phone and using it to create content. Obviously, clearly, we would never do that at Hellios. But to your point around training and the data that firms are now using to train their own AI, is there a danger that AI has already kind of corrupted the learning already?
I think it's a really good point, because it's kind of that grey IT question that's been around for a long time, just given new life by new new tools that are available, how do you understand what people are doing? It used to be people doing things in spreadsheets on their desktop and that not being properly controlled. It's a very similar, but just a new example of that. And it comes down to training and education, so that people understand what is and is not permitted. We've been through quite extensive training that's been rolled out to everyone at PwC. I'm sure others are doing similar. That includes making points like, if you've used Gen AI to produce something, make sure it's really clear that that's how you've produced it, so that people understand that's what it is and it can be reviewed in that context. So that end user education is really important, as well as the kind of technical controls that you might implement around restricting access to Gen AI tools through the computers. You can never mitigate against someone using their personal device, sitting at their desk to put something through ChatGPT, but you can educate the users as to what the implications are of that.
And just maybe to bolt on a couple of thoughts from me here as well. So I think it's essentially the old shadow IT issue, right, that many of us have been grappling with for decades ultimately, right? But it's quite an interesting scenario because there's no procurement angle. You don't have to procure a service, or you can use ChatGPT for free on your mobile, to your point, right? So some of those procurement controls you can put in even around micro spend, that it's not relevant in this scenario. So I think the training is where I was leading to organically when you said that. Where I would think everyone in this call could maybe start to think in terms of managing the risk across the supply chain is making sure your suppliers are aware of that as well. And that training and governance point is really important, right? We typically tend to ask that question from a security perspective or other, and it's almost like not nice to have control, but it can feel a bit fluffy to an extent at times. But I think it's probably a lot more critical from a AI point of view, that we get comfortable that our suppliers do have education and awareness programs, and there's some sort of penalty or system in place for using AI without acknowledging it or using it properly.
Uncontrolled, yeah.
Uncontrolled.
Another question from Ian, and thank you, Ian. Checks in the post for this one. Will we be updating our FSQS questionnaire to include AI questions? Yes, is the answer. But what they will be is up to you. We are buyer-led, and that's why we're running the session today, is to get you thinking about what sort of questions we think, or you think you should be asking. And we'd like to feed it into the next uplift of our question set, which is running right now. If you need to know more, then talk to your account manager, talk to your SDM. We have a view, but we don't want to prescribe. We want you as buyers to tell us what's important. All I would say is we don't want another 50, 60 questions. We don't want to create another sort of information security beast of a question set here. And if you were asking me based on my pot of coffee and weekend reading of the Act, it would be questions around the risk assessment and the usage, and some supplementary questions around policy standards and some controls, maybe a question or two around escalation and event management and things like that. But have a look at the slides that the guys have presented, and I think you'll see those themes kind of running through. Would you agree, Ian, Tom, for that?
I would. And look, I think with this, we don't necessarily need to boil the ocean, right? So we're going to add in a new risk domain, but actually a lot of the controls that we would place reliance on will exist elsewhere across the FSQS framework anyway. So like your cyber controls, your software development, etc. So we can certainly do a read across, or I would suggest and recommend everybody do a read across, start to paint that picture, not too dissimilar how we would have done it for operational resilience, right? Where are some of the sums of the parts that can come together, and then whatever the delta is, let's focus on that as a specific risk type.
And I think that's why the ownership is so important, because if you give it to someone who's already in the mix and has got FSQS questions they care about, then you're not starting from scratch. You're not creating a whole new set of questions. You're building on strong foundations. So one to think on. Mike, I'm not getting any more Q&A coming through. I know Sam, Kezi, you've got any more there that have popped up that I can't see? You can talk. No? Okay. Good. Well, look, we're almost out of time. So thank you all for making the time. Before you all run off to your next meeting or lunch, depending if you're lucky enough to have a lunch break, I'd like you to stay on the call for about 20 seconds after the webinar's closed, because we'll have our short survey link on there, and we would welcome your feedback, please. It takes, 20, 30 seconds to fill in. Please just let us know what you think. So if it's good, I can take all the credit, and if it's not, I can blame it, Ian. Very good. Look, I'll just sort of finish off. Say thank you very much, Ian and Tom. I know your time is precious, and thank you for taking this time out to talk us through this. We will be sharing the slides, we will be sharing the content, and we will be shamelessly liking you both on our social posts. So please, everyone, comment, like, uptick, whatever, to make us all feel good about doing this. But look, thank you so much. Please stay on for the survey. But have a good day, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Paul, and everyone. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.